that he's come to talk to us today.
Thank you very much, John, and indeed it's a great pleasure to be here. It's not the first time I'm in this room, but it's always great to be back. So the title of my talk today, as you can see, is Dynamic Algorithmic Networks of Visual Categorization. Starting with the observation that we humans are compulsive categorizers. From the moment we open our eyes, we will try to step out of the bed, not fall and recognize where the floor is, then walk into our rooms, that's not mine, make sure we don't stumble into furnitures, and then, of course, for those who like coffee, go to the kitchen, locate the coffee machine, the coffee cup, the water, assemble these things well, and make ourselves a cup of coffee. And even as I speak, I'm scanning your faces for signs of understanding, which are the typical nods and smiles. So categorization, visual categorization, is near continuous, but I'm sure you know this already. What we know much less is how is it done, particularly in the brain. So current models and theories would say that we start from an image like this, then we process some categorization features from the face that, if we know this particular person, enables us to say it's Rachel. Of course, from the same image, we can use different features to say that the face is smiling and it's a young face. And such feature processing has become the hallmark of models of visual categorization in the brain, but also in recent deep network models, which, as you know, are starting to categorize the way humans do. And we'll put this between quotes, of course. However, the deceptive simplicity of visual categorization is, of course, masked by the great complexity of the visual brain. So what we want now to do is try to address some of the gaps that we have in our knowledge to achieve an understanding of flexible visual categorization. The first gap is, in general, we don't know what the categorization features are that enables us to go from the stimulus to this or that categorization of the same picture. And because we don't know what the categorization features are, we cannot know where, when, and how the brain and its model processes them for behavior. And this will very much be the aim of this talk, to address these questions of what the features are, where, when, and how they are processed for flexible visual categorizations of stimuli. All right. You might wonder, why is this important? After all, we see many models these days that predict very well categorization behaviors for images. So why do we need to explain? Well, because models in science in general are not just designed to predict things, behavioral responses or brain responses, but also to explain them. And to explain them, we need to understand how the features are processed via specific computations. And we call these algorithmic tunnels. And of course, once we have clear models, we can seek to optimize them, to improve them, or to understand the causes of this or that responses from the stimulus. And it turns out that because now we have these DNNs who can, in principle, self-drive cars, it's very useful to understand visual categorizations in the brain so that we can develop a human-validated, understandable, and trustable AI. These are hot topics at the moment in AI, which would be informed by human categorization. So to fix ideas, let me show you how things are done these days typically. So typically we'd start from a database of images of that sort in categorization research, and we would seek to get human responses and model predictions that are shared. That is, the model and the human should say Rachel, happy, young. And this is denoted here by this intersection. Whoops. By this intersection. However, the problem is that if we have a database of such images, the images themselves form a black box. So we cannot know from this black box what specific features caused the specific responses. To move to causal models, instead of just predictive ones, we have to make a step change, which is to take this face and parameterize it. For example, via a 3D face scanner. And then we can start to play with features of shape, as you see here, features of complexion, features of rotation, illumination, translation, and so on and so forth. And if we model the stimulus well, we can also make it move different aspects of it, facial movements. We can also age at will, and then start to measure whether we have, of course, human and model responses which are similar because they are due to the same feature causes. So now we are looking at a triple intersection in white where the features are shared between these behaviors. Okay? And then, and only then, in fact, when we know the features that cause the behavior, we can compare across the brain and its models whether they are processed with similar computations. That is, do we get to the same behaviors across humans and models because we have the same computations performed on the categorization features that we control. Okay, so this is the big picture. And we want to do this, that is, establish the second and third degree of equivalence, going away from the degree of predictions, to explain categorization behavior via algorithmic networks. And we want to do this for faces, but also for objects and scenes, obviously, not just confine ourselves to faces. So it's a big program of which we haven't done much, as you will see, but there's still some steps along the way. So to reiterate, here's the brain. We need first to set a task, like the identity of Rachel versus her age versus her expression. We need to control the stimulus dimensions, because their intersection will tell us which features are task relevant for identity or for expression. And then we can couple this with a system, via brain measures, for example, to understand where, when, and how these features are processed. And as you will see towards the very end of the talk, you can apply this approach, as you do with the brain, with deep neural network models of the brain. So let me fix ideas with a very old research that we've done many years ago, so you can see how far we can go with this. So let's see that your task is to detect a face versus saying that there's no face. It's a very simple 2AFC, yes-no type of task. So we show you a stimulus like this, which you can think as generative, because each feature of the stimulus is simply a pixel, and we set it randomly to black or white. So in a given trial, we generate white noise. And we ask you as a participant, do you see a face in there or do you not see a face? Okay, so we go across a few trials like this. People tell us, yes, I don't see a face there, I see a face underneath. And after many trials, we do a simple, what's called reverse correlation task, which is simply to build the correlation between a black or a white pixel and seeing face or no face. And when we do this, we see that the participant, from memory, because there was nothing in the stimulus but pure noise, classified the pure noise in terms of I see a face or not, when there were two eyes in the noise, if you want, when they perceived two eyes that were not there, because it was only noise, the stimulus. And we can repeat this across participants and see that the features that they use to classify noise from memory into I see a face or no face change a bit. So this first participant is quite similar to this one. This one has much more structure in the chin, in the hair, in the eyes. This one you can see two eyes here, the nose, maybe the nose line, and an element of eyebrows. Okay? So what's important here is we asked what is the information that a participant uses from memory to detect a face. We've used white noise as a stimulus, and we have characterized what's in their memory to sort the noise into yes, I see a face, no, I don't. And we can show which are the features that they use to do this from memory, and you see them here. This was many years ago. We did the first experiment on this in 2002. And we called it superstitious perception because, of course, there's no stimulus. It's only white noise. But we can generalize now this. Let me just, I've been told how to turn off the light. We can now generalize this approach to create noise in a multivariate space that's three-dimensional instead of a univariate space of pixels. So bear with me and you will see how we do this. So we take a database of face identities that we have that we have scanned in 3D. We then use a general linear model to extract the features of age, of ethnicity, of gender and their interactions. And then we are left with, for each face, residuals. These residuals represent the identity of the face away from the average of a given age, ethnicity, gender, and interactions. We can then use all of these residuals, take a principal and component analysis of them. These are the components of face identity then. And we can represent each identity as a feature vector, which you see here, that multiplies the residuals. Okay, so bearing this in mind then, we can set random residuals in the PC by setting weights randomly. We multiply it by the principal components. We add this to the face average, for example, fixing the age to 36 years old, West Caucasian, female, plus interactions, and then we will generate faces that share with this norm all of these features, but will differ in identity features. And so you can generate other identity features randomly, and here's another face. Other identity features randomly, and here's yet another face. So to reiterate, these are random variations of face identity that are added to a common average of a 36-year-old Western Caucasian female. Why? Because at the time we did this experiment, we were asking participants who knew from memory as good colleagues a female of 36 years old, 36 years of age, who was Western Caucasian, and we wanted to know which features they had represented about her in their memory. So how do we do this? It's very similar to the former experiment. We generate 6 such random identities. We have a judgment. It can be very different from the face that they have in memory, or it can be very similar. And so we are setting up a regression analysis, essentially, where the participant on this trial could judge this face and say, it's similar on this level to Rachel. Across many trials, we, as I've said, build a regression that we can do at the level of one 3D vertex or one principal component of identity. It's the same idea. And then we can extract the 3D template that they have in memory for Rachel as a deviation from the average of 36-year-old female of Western Caucasian origin. And then we can render, as you see here, the categorization features for Rachel in 3D. So to reiterate, these are the features that this participant has in memory for Rachel, rendered in 3 dimensions. And then what you can do is scan Rachel's face. Here it is. You see here in different levels of gray how she varies from the norm that I have referred to, 36-year-old Western Caucasian female. And you can see that Rachel has a thinner nose, a pouty mouth, and a prominent forehead compared to an average. And so you can plot every single vertex of this face in terms of how outward or inward it goes in reference to this norm. And then you can take the categorization features here and plot them in the same way, in the same space. How different outward versus inward they go. For example, a pinched nose will go inward. A pouty mouth will go outward. And if the representation of Rachel was veridical in the mind of the participants, then you would have a diagonal line of veridicality. Any change that you make in 3D in the real world is reflected by the same change in 3D in the mind of the participant. And what you see here colored are the features that are indeed veridical of Rachel's face in the mind of the participant, which are the inward pinched nose, the thinner pointy chin going inward, and outward primarily the pouty mouth and the bigger eyes. Okay, so what have we done? We have used, this time in a multivariate space of 3D features, random identity noise in 3D in order to be able to extract in the mind of the participant the memory that they have of a given face identity. And when we have these features, we can check whether we can apply them then in a generalization task to differences of viewpoint from when the participant extracted the features in the experiment. It was always face on. Now we try different views, as you can see. But we can also change the gender of the face applying the same identity features due to the modeling that we had to create siblings. You will see the siblings going soon. So for Rachel, it will be a male. Here's her brother. And then you can also age them. You will see her going a bit older now. Okay? And you can check in an experiment whether individuals still recognize the identity of the features through changes of viewpoint, through changes of age and gender. Okay? You could do this, of course, ad nauseam with illumination, translation, and so forth. But we picked some of the most important ones. All right, so we have done a lot of experiments based on these ideas. I've just illustrated a few. And what I want to show you now is how far we have gone with the feature generation of our stimuli. And it will be a little demo. I'll make sure that the sound is on so you can hear it well.
Hello, this is a brief demo of a generative model of dynamic 3D faces. As you can see, they can speak. We can also control the features of face shape and complexion. And the features of face movements. And those of eye movements. Hello.
Okay, so as you can see, that's quite an expressive generative model. We can change a lot of features in it. And of course, we can use all of this into experiments of all sorts. This is particularly useful in the context, for example, of facial expressions of emotion, where we can show, again, a random animation of facial movements, where we vary this time not parameters of 3D shape, but parameters of the 42 action units, which are independent movements of facial muscles, and where we can vary randomly parameters of onset, acceleration, peak amplitude, peak latency, of deceleration, offset. And this is one such random choice of these parameters, so action units, and for each one of them their dynamic parameters. And then we can ask the participant which one is of these expressions does this look the most like. And after many trials of that type, we can reconstruct for each of the facial expressions what is it that the participant uses from memory to recognize these facial signals. And you see them here for the 6 classic expressions of Ekman. We have studied loads of aspects of facial expressions of emotion, cultural variations, dynamic hierarchy of signals. How are they expressed over time? We found that, for example, the eyes and the wrinkling of the nose are expected by the participant sooner than the broad movement of the mouth, for example. So starting with 4 core patterns, expressing signals of approach avoidance, going later to categorizations of the refined emotions. We've looked at valence and arousal as well. Then we've also looked at a variety of social messages. As you can see, there's quite a lot. But finally, this is particularly interesting for people who have, like me, an interest between psychology and AI. Why? Because all of these models of facial expressions I'm not used to this particular. Okay. Of cultural attractiveness, these models are directly transferable onto intelligent agent for artificial intelligence, so they can express signals in a way that's human validated and therefore better than what is typically engineered by hand into these virtual agents. In addition, on the decoding side, we can use these 3D models to read out, say, videos of facial expressions of emotion or videos of faces. We can say which ethnicity they have, what kind of dominance they have, for example. So this is what we do then in AI here. All right, so I've spent quite a lot of time on purpose to explain how different tasks applied to the same faces could lead to categorization features, which is the first intersection you see here, and how we can go from simple 2D images. Some people who know previous work we've done will also use bubbles on 2D images, to now generative models that better control the cause in 3 dimensions of 2D images. And then what we will do next, and we'll spend the rest of the talk on this, we will now couple brain measures to these first 2 factors and start examining this triple intersection here, which is where, when, and how does the brain process categorization features from the stimulus for behavior. And also this interesting intersection here in purple, magenta, which tells us that some features are represented in the brain, but they are not relevant for behavior. You will see what this means soon. And we will do this in the brain first. And the reason why it's important to know the categorization features is because we have a needle of information that the brain must process in its task to achieve behavior. So we can just look for it into brain activity. Let me just change the lighting. Okay. Okay, so we'll start with a simple experiment that will go back to the pixel world, where we have here a famous painting of Dali called Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire. And if you look here carefully, you can see that you have the faces of 2 nuns with their hats and their dresses. But if you squint a bit, you will see instead that this altogether forms the face of Voltaire. Okay? So the way we then go about this is we cut the part that is ambiguous and we sample stimulus features. across spatial frequencies here using small Gaussian apertures. That's the bubble approach. And we ask the participant, so these are the stimuli, so it's the blue set that you see here, and we ask the participant, tell us when you see Voltaire, the nonce, versus when you opt out. So for example here, the participant would likely opt out. They wouldn't know. I'm just illustrating the sampling. Here, they might say, yeah, it looks more like Voltaire. And here, they might say it looks more like the nonce. So after many such trials, we can compute again the relationship between the samples, the behaviors, and show that the features that people use from this image to perceive Voltaire are represented as such across different spatial frequency bands. Sorry, that's for the nonce. So it's the two nonce phase that you can see in high spatial frequency in particular. Whereas for Voltaire, it's more the broad face of Voltaire in lower spatial frequency. So that's good, because now we have this handle of the information that the brain processes for these two perceptions. So we can look at where, when, and how the brain processes these categorization features. I need to say a few things here so that the results I will show are not misinterpreted. In everything you will see from now on, you have to consider that we have variation of a feature, for example, a nonce face. Why? Because on each trial it's randomly sampled by the bubbles procedure. So either it's not shown, in which case the feature is not visible. This is what's here in blue. Or it's fully shown. The bubble just landed right on the face. In which case the feature is here. It's high visibility. But of course you can have everything in between, such as when half of the eye is shown. Okay. And then what you want to know is how the response of the brain, here it's an MEG source that we call A at time t1, represents the variation of the stimulus visibility. So when you have something like this, you have a linear relationship. The more visible the feature, the stronger the response of the source. And so you compute the mutual information between these two variables, which you can think as a nonlinear correlation, if there's such a thing. And you can show then that on this source, at 120 milliseconds, we will say there's a peak representation into the MEG variations of the variation of the feature. Yeah? So it's really a representation of the feature. A bit later on another source that we will call B, at a time t2, which is 100 milliseconds later, we find another source here that's also representing the variations of the feature. Okay? So then we can ask the next question, which is, does A transmit its feature to B? So can we reconstruct in the brain a network that represents and communicates features rather than a network that has some signal and then some signal on the other side? That's important because it gets us to some kind of cognitive explanation of communications in the brain. And the answer is yes, we've developed a measure that does this, that's called directed feature information. I will not go over it. It's simply a development of transfer entropy that enables us to conclude the transfer that you are seeing is about a feature. The transfer between two sources, that is. Okay, so why is this important? Well, because if you see that a given brain region, sorry, this thing is not for me. Okay. When you see that a given brain region represents two features, but then only sends one to another region, you know that something has been filtered out or reduced. Here, for example, a schematic right eye. Or similarly, when you see a first region, say, right occipital cortex, and another one, say, left occipital cortex, coding the eyes of a face, that are then sent to a third region where later on the two eyes are represented, it's giving you some indication that there could be a computation in this region that combines the two features. So we can start slowly to get to representation of features, communication of features, and then operations over features. We will see all of this. So let's start with some results. Oops, not this one, this one. Okay, so here you see the brain sources representing, in the context of the nonce perception, the right nonce phase. This is the time evolving, and after a while, you can see the feature being represented. Now the counter will reset, and you see the blue nonce phase also being represented, and the counter resets again, as you can see at the top. And we now see the green feature that's representing the face of Voltaire. So you see here all the task-relevant features being represented dynamically in the brain and propagating, as you would expect, to the right fusiform gyrus, which is represented in gray. So we restart the counter, and we go one feature at a time. First, the right nonce phase in left occipital cortex. Then the counter will restart now. The left nonce phase in right occipital cortex. Here we go. Of course, this would happen in parallel. I'm just going feature by feature for the explanation. And then we see the green face of Voltaire when the counter restarts now. Okay, and they all migrate towards the right fusiform gyrus, as you will soon see. Okay, so that's a dynamic representation of features in the context of the participant responding nonce versus Voltaire. Of course, the brain represents more features than those that are task relevant. So look at them now. They are represented as well and color-coded. Oh, but they vanish very quickly from the brain into occipital cortex. We look at this again. So they get represented about 70 milliseconds. But as we get to 170 milliseconds, they're all gone. Whereas before they were not. So let's look at this more seriously, as psychophysicists do. Participant, that we call observer, it's more serious. By participant. You can see here the dynamic representation of features that are irrelevant to the task of categorizing Voltaire versus the nonce. And again, you see here this measure of mutual information that I've shown you before. So it's the variation of the feature against the variation of the MEG source. And the sources that get involved here in these 5 curves are located here in the small brains. Okay? And you have here their onset time. So the more scient, the earlier they get an onset. The most notable result is what you have seen in the animation. At 170 milliseconds, this information has been reduced. It's not in the brain anymore. It's not task relevant. If we compare this now to features that are task relevant, you can see that we can trace them across the brain over time leading to response, across different brain regions, including higher level regions. So they go well beyond the occipital. And these are the features concerned by these representations. So there's a big difference between the representation of task-relevant and task-irrelevant features. So let's look at how these then represent. As I've said, task-relevant features move into the right fusiform gyrus, and you can see this developing here over time. And if you look at the voxels, the sources of the right fusiform gyrus, you can see here at the very top of the fusiform gyrus, where the radius of the source indicates how many of these features it represents, that there's a definite region in the right fusiform gyrus that represents many features about these two perceptions, Voltaire versus nonce. And they come from occipital cortex, but this time, as we will see in the next slide, they agglomerate in the right fusiform gyrus. Maybe they are linearly combined, who knows? Or non-linearly, who knows? But for now, you can see them here. Now, what we can do is start to split this and look at it in terms of which specific features do these sources represent in the right fusiform gyrus. And you can see, for example, in the context of the perception of the nonce, we have the left nonce face in turquoise in high spatial frequency, the orange face in high spatial frequency, we have the blue face in next to high, the red face in next to high, and a bit of this color maybe of a dress, and you can see them represented here and here in the right fusiform gyrus, where each source shows by the pi the proportion of a given feature that it represents. So here we have mainly the left nonce face and a bit of the color, where here we have the right nonce face in orange, and maybe also a bit of the left nonce face. Yeah? That's clear to everyone? And of course, if we switch perception, we will see something quite different, whereby now the same source in the same participant, and when the participant responds Voltaire, represent, as you can see, primarily the green face of Voltaire, and also some of the eyes of Voltaire, this time in blue and red. Okay? So what have we done? First, we have characterized the categorization features. Why? Because they are an explicit hypothesis on the information that the brain must process for two categorization tasks. Here, Voltaire versus nonce. And so these features necessarily connect stimulus to behavior. And here are the features in question. So there are this needle information to find in the haystack of brain activity. And then we have shown, using the tools that we have, where, when, and to some extent how networks in the brain represent task-relevant features, but then seem to reduce task-irrelevant features. So represent them here, reduce them here. So we can start to infer functions at network node level, and we can study them further. And then we have also shown, at some level of precision, how the sources represent the features associated with different categorizations in the right fusiform gyrus. So let me reopen the light. I've been advised that otherwise people get to sleep. So one thing that we then did is to replicate the task of Voltaire and the nonce with a more realistic stimulus. And John and colleagues, this is what I was trying to discuss with you earlier on. So this is the experiment in question. So where you have here a female walker on a sidewalk, a male face, it's supposed to be a kind of selfie, which is neutral, and you also have here a car parked by the other sidewalk, and it's an SUV. But the stimuli could change as much as this, where you now have a male walker, a female smiling face, and a car parked by the sidewalk, not an SUV. So so what we did here was to generate all the combinatorics of these categorization responses into stimuli. And then we sampled the stimuli with the classic bubbles experiment, which will reveal and hide some features. And it's a within participant task, where the participant could say happy neutral for the central face, male, female, for the gender of the pedestrian, male, female, and for the car, for the vehicle, car versus SUV. Okay? And all the trials were identically sampled across tasks. So there's absolutely no effect here of the stimulus. It's not possible. All right, and we had about 1,500 trials per block, so we had good power when it comes to MIGI analysis. So what we do, of course, is we do per participant analysis, which you see here color-coded, of the specific features that they will use in each task. and we have some variations across participants as is expected, so we don't assume some kind of a universal algorithm working here, but rather some participant-specific ones. So you can see, of course, that different categorizations will select different features from the same stimulus. That's not very surprising. It didn't surprise us either that, for example, the same response SUV could imply choice of very different features across participants. But in all cases, if the participant uses different features in the same task, and if we want to control how these features are processed, then we must do per participant brain analysis. And that's what we do. So let me show you then how it works. It's quite interesting. We do the same analysis as what we've done before, so we compute the mutual information between the visibility of the categorization feature and the MEG source. So we start here, and we have a source here which is in occipital cortex. It's located here in blue, and you can see that at some point in time, the sources represents with a spread of activity the spread of visibility of the feature. That's the MI that I've talked to you about before. So you can see low visible to high visible, low to high is represented across the MEG range of response. Yes? And this is in occipital cortex. In the right fusiform gyrus, we have the same behavior. So the right fusiform gyrus source also represents the spread of visibility with a spread of activity about 150 to some millisecond. All right. So if we now look at a similar plot to the one you've seen before, where you have the feature of each task as columns, and you have the task as row, you can see on the diagonal the pattern that you saw for Voltaire and the nuns when they were task relevant. So this is the representation of the task relevant features by the participants. What happens off diagonal? Well, you can see the sort of pattern that we saw before, that when the vehicle is irrelevant to categorize a phase, it's represented early on and then reduced. And the same applies here for the eyes, for example. And it's a pattern that we saw in general across the off diagonal. So let's see what happens then back in this video. When the feature is task irrelevant, it's also represented on the occipital source, as you can see. But if you look carefully, you will see something interesting. It's represented in an opposite direction. So the occipital source somehow has the knowledge that when it represents a feature, it's task relevant or it's task irrelevant. And what you will see is that as we get into the right fusiform gyrus source, the feature is simply not represented at all. Okay. So, what have we shown so far? We've characterized the categorization features per participant. We have looked at where, when, and how they were selected for multiple behaviors. And we can see a first stage between 50 and 170 milliseconds, where where the representation in occipital cortex is highly dimensional. All features are represented, at least many. We've repeated this across all the features of the image, across all the pixels of the image, in fact. But we see that the same feature can be marked for selection or reduction depending on the task. In the second stage, the features progress through the ventral and dorsal pathway, as you can see here. It happens past 170 milliseconds. It becomes lower dimensional and focused solely on the features of categorization. So it looks as if at the junction between occipital cortex and the ventral pathway, around 120 milliseconds, visual processing transitions from high-dimensional to categorization features on that. That is the features leading to behavior. Good. I hope you are still following me. So what we will do now, in the few minutes that are left, is look more specifically at the how. The beauty of tracing features, as I've said before, is that you can see where they go in network sources, and you can start to look at the level of these sources at what computations are made specifically on these features. We will go here into these computations in much more detail. So for this, we will go back to computation theory and use binary inputs, dark lens, clear lens on the left, clear lens, dark lens on the right. So these are two binary inputs, first lens, second lens. They can be 0 and 1. Yeah? And we can look at the responses of the system to these inputs, and this is the famous XOR, which happens when the two inputs are the same, they belong to the same category, but when the two inputs are different, they belong to different categories. Okay? And we will ask how the hierarchy of the brain deals with this very basic XOR problem and contrast it with an OR problem and an AND problem. For those who've done logic, these are XOR, AND, and OR gates. Okay, so let me show you how it works. And then I'll go into how it's computed, how we get to there. Okay, so here's an animation running where you have here occipital cortex. You can see that it represents contralaterally the right and left lenses initially. I can tell you it's a linear representation. Then here, when we get to the fusiform gyrus, it represents the both lenses together in the right fusiform gyrus, but it's again linear. But when we get to parietal cortex, we see the first nonlinear representation of the two lenses into MEG activity. And then as we keep going to, in time, we get to the nonlinear representation in post-central gyrus. And I'll rerun this so you can see it better. I'll get there. Okay, so here we go. You'll start contralateral representation of the lens here, and by the lens I mean their on-off state. Then representations of both here in the fusiform gyrus, linear as well, but they are represented together on the same source. Here we see the integration of the two lenses starting, so that's a nonlinear operation in XOR. And then finally we see this in post-central gyrus that's related to reaction time later on. Okay? So how is this done? Well, simply, this is a schematic representation of the video that you have seen. We compute a linear model that codes the on-off state of the left lens, the on-off state of the right lens, the on-off state of the two lenses in the same MEG activity, and we add a linear model with an interaction term as well to see whether the interaction between the two eyes is represented in the MEG activity. And we find early on, as you can see here, in occipital cortex, representation of each eye, in the right fusiform gyrus, representation of the two eyes, and then in XOR, at around 250 milliseconds in parietal region, the solution to the XOR problem for behavior. If we move to the AND control, you can see it's just the same profile. And to the OR control, it's again the same profile. That is, linear representation contralaterally in occipital cortex, dual linear representation in the right fusiform gyrus, and then slightly, depending on which operation it's done, it's the interactive term between the two lenses in parietal or in aspects of ventral. So why is this important? Because we can now get to look at the actual unfolding over time, which would be expressed here by little circles of increasing radii with increasing blackness, of when a node linearly separates, as is the case here, all the stimuli with the left lens on, which are here, here, on if you want black to be on, from all the stimuli with the left lens off. And you see this unfolding in time in this space, because you can draw a line here that separates them. And then you can see later on, at the same time, but this time on the left occipital source, separation of all the lenses of all stimuli with all the right lens on, and all of those with the left lens on. And then when we get, and this is the same across all of the three tasks, but when we get to the computation for decision, that starts around 250 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds in parietal cortex, you can see how the discrimination differs across the tasks. Where we can see here the two different being grouped together, the two same being grouped together, whereas here the solution to OR is this one is no, and all of these three are together as yes, and for AND, this one is yes, and all of these three are no, and you can see them separated into immediate activity as such. All right, I'll wrap up with this. I will not develop this, it would be a talk in itself, but the beauty of having not just images, but the 3D features that generate images enable you to check whether the brain and its DNN models, of which here you see a few, respond in the same way because they process the same stimulus features. We have a paper published on this. And then once you control the stimulus features, you can also go into the layers of the DNN to understand up until which layer the DNN represents, say, variations of lighting, of translation, of rotation, or face identity, or even represents the background. So here, after layer 3, the background is reduced. It's not part of the representation anymore. Whereas identity only emerges as a representation from layer 5 or layer 4 onwards, and the task, of course, here is a face identity task. All right, so I will conclude to say that we are using very heavily the triple of stimulus features from a generative model, brain and network measures and behavior, to first infer the features that are relevant for a given categorization task. I'll turn on the light again. We can then track how categorization relevant features, task irrelevant features, are represented in brain networks, human brain networks or DNN models. And once we get there, we can start inferring functions of selection of task-relevant features, reduction of task-relevant features, linear combination of task-relevant features, nonlinear integration of task-relevant features, and therefore start to derive an algorithm that explains how stimulus features give rise to behavior. Where do we go now? We are very interested in looking at some form of information processing equivalence across modalities of brain measures, for example, EEG and MEG, or MEG and fMRI, to integrate their relative strength in terms of feature processing. We also want to go much deeper into understanding how features are similarly processed in the brain and DNN models, particularly for layers. It's not enough to show that DNNs and brain respond in the same way to images if we don't know what causes these responses. We also want to keep changing behaviors on the same stimuli in order to distinguish different types of information processing in different tasks, such as looking at a face, judge its identity versus its expression. So we want to have a clear control of the behaviors people do. And of course I couldn't help but commenting on two aspects of psychophysics, which is that having a generative model of a few categories is better than a very large collection of uncontrolled 2D images, because we need to control the features that cause behavior and responses. And also, and I hope to have convinced you that because people use different features from the same object to respond the same thing, we need to make sure that we switch to individual models of individual participants. Thank you very much.
That was very impressive. Many thanks indeed. Question? Oh, no, before that, we normally have a break, so if anyone who needs to go can slip away. There are serious people left to ask you questions. Questions for Philippe?
Thank you so much, that was fascinating. But those are questions. Just to start with one, which I might just have missed. Did you have an explanation for how it is that at that early time point, that a pivotal source is representing the same information in a different way? That when it's relevant, when it's irrelevant, it's being represented differently?
Yeah, that's precisely what I was discussing with John over here before coming to this talk. It's something that interests us a lot. I'm not presenting all the data of this experiment. We now have a strong indication that the reason why there's this opponent representation of the same feature by task relevance is due to frontal modulation. So it could very well be, particularly in the context of this experiment where things are blocked, that there's some kind of control, top-down, instructing to mark a feature for being task relevant and therefore forgotten, versus task relevant and passed through for further processing. But to really do it properly, we need to probably control the task on a per-trial basis, and then examine the different networks associated with each one of the tasks, then on the same stimuli again.
It's really fascinating to think that that's not just a gating mechanism, but actually a difference in representation from the get-go.
Yeah, it's something that is still surprising us, to be frank, because we didn't expect it either. And for those who know MEG, we were very thorough. So we did the source model across all tasks. So it's not an artifact of source modeling in one way and then the other, then you get different signs. No, not at all. Everything was done across all tasks for the source model. So if we have this difference, it means something. What exactly?
Well, yeah, I'm just wondering what more we've learned about this classical idea, idea of there being a face space, right? Which you might not agree with, I don't know. But of course, we still don't know what the natural dimensions of the face space are. Because in all of your studies, you pre-select the dimensions to go on.
Very true.
Do you think there's some way we can, use some of your methods to sort of discover, as it were, the natural, the dimensions that the category spaces are? outside the lab.
I would hope, but in order to tease apart between different models of this phase space, you need to come up with different hypotheses as to how to create that space, to then test it against the brain. And so the next step of looking at a system like this one, especially where we have, you just go back one step, okay. When you have these three dimensions, stimulus feature, because it becomes a model, should itself be a multitude of models. And then, of course, you have to select that which best explains your data. Not many people do this with big realistic stimuli. In fact, I can't think of anyone. So it will be a very unsatisfactory answer because it's then down to the imagination of the researcher to come up with different types of phase space. The original one had to do with an average and distances from an average. So it's norm-based. Is norm-based the best way to think about this? I mean, it's certainly simple. I'm not sure. In principle, if you could come with n models, amongst which there's a good one, yes. But we need to come up with them, and so far, imagination on stimulus design has not been great.
Interested in this question of bottom-up versus top-down
Yes.
representations that you
Yes.
already mentioned, and thinking of particularly of the nuns versus Voltaire
Yes.
example, and you sort of said, you know, if you squint your eyes, you'll start to see Voltaire. To what extent do you think perhaps the representations associated with Voltaire might have some degree of top-down representation influence, and can you sort of dissociate or distinguish bottom-up from those top-down influences in that?
Yes.
Excellent.
I don't want to go too much into it because it's very much, it's not even off the press. I was literally still writing aspects of it today with Yuning Yan, who's doing this. So what we can do it essentially. So what we can do is vary independently into a stimulus the distribution of the number of Gabor Voltaire features, the proportion of nonce Gabor features. You see them here at 50-50. Yeah. And then what you can do is essentially a decoding analysis in MEG, whereby you train a classifier on every 4 milliseconds of the MEG response on a localizer of, say, 100% nonce, 100% Voltaire. And then you get a pattern for each. And then when you get to a queuing design, such as this one, where you have a queue for upcoming Voltaire, a blank, a fixation, a stimulus, a response, you can examine this 1.2 second time window and see whether you get a reversal of your bottom-up from the localizer discrimination Voltaire versus nonce. And you do. That's the upshot. But the beauty of having now parameterized the stimuli, because you've got a generative model essentially of them, is that you can also train a classifier not on the discrimination as is typically done, A versus B, but how much of A versus low of B. So you can train your classifier to discriminate 80% and above Voltaire to 20% and below Voltaire, and do the same independently for the nonce. And then you can track, doing again this decoding analysis, at the prediction stage, what is it of Voltaire that's replayed, as is called in this literature, and then where does it go? So we, for example, saw that there was a split between nonce and Voltaire by hemisphere doing that. So can we distinguish top-down from bottom-up? Yes, this is how we do it. When we blocked the experiment as we do before, no. And that's why we moved to a design like this to be able to do it.
with these ambiguous types of stimuli, you can often have the experience that you can control which one you see, and you can swap between your perception of one and then the other. So could you come up with an experimental paradigm where you could sort of track that and see, as people are swapping from one perception to the other perception, where the top-down influence of that is being represented?
Yes. In fact, that's... maybe I shouldn't go into it. I'm not confident enough, frankly, to present it all, but the idea is yes, because what you can do is you can take your decoder value at prediction, where you wait for the stimulus, and see the extent to which how much of an evidence you predict then influence your behavior. And the answer, you have the relationship. And you can do this in situation when it's ambiguous, essentially, because that's where you want to see the bias, right? And so it's working, but I'd rather send you the paper when it's written.
Forward to it. Thank you.
So the other amazing strength of this is that you're doing it at the individual subject level. So what have you learned about individual differences? And have you looked at, I guess, the obvious question of relationships to conditions where face processing is different?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. The first thing we learned was years ago with Richard Jack, which was that the 6 universals of Ekman were in fact not universal models, where we could show that, I typically have this animation with me, but it's not right here. The model for happy in the East Asian culture involved a lot more of the eyebrows and a flick of the eye here, whereas in the Western Caucasian it was more the mouth. And then as we published this, we realized that the emoticons reflected that, where the emoticon for happy is this in the East Asian culture, whereas ours is of course that. So that's one thing we've learned. Then we've gone to attractiveness, and we have modeled how to go from a not so attractive to an attractive face in each culture, and found that different features modulate this attractiveness in different culture, which again mapped, because all this is validated, of course, expectations from each culture. I could show you these figures. They're all in papers. So we've learned this from a behavioral standpoint, which implies that we have different predictions what would happen in the brain. Right? We'd expect East Asians to process happy very much from here, and Western Caucasian very much from there. And from what we know, this could be faster than that, for example, because people tend to first look in the eyes, then go down the mouth. When they process feed, we show this along the N170, for example, that your first, just after the P1, your first features are the eyes, and then you see them coded over time, going down. It's almost like a scanning band. It's quite impressive. It's an old paper, this, but we've replicated many times. Now, when you get to the brain, other than people using different features, our experiments are so constrained and they involve so many trials that you kind of find the same thing, which is great, it replicates, everyone's happy. But maybe if we wanted to look at how different people represent different things, we'd really need to have, as is the case, say, with these expressions, knowledge from behavior that the strategies are quite different. And then we would see how they are differently processed in the brain.
It's a general property of these ambiguous figures that if you keep looking, you get spontaneous reversals.
Yes.
So, is there anything in your model that can account for the existence of these reversals?
No. And the main reason why the model doesn't have anything for this is that, remember, on each trial information is sampled. And so if we were to take a measure of confidence together with the information that's sampled and try to get a gradient, I'm pretty sure we'd see very clear features for one switching to very clear features for the other, and not much in the middle. So these experiments are not well tailored to study reversal.
I know for auditory ambiguous figures, you can detect changes in brain activity just before that
Yes.
perceptual
Yes.
reversal occurs.
Yeah. This has been studied extensively, say, by David Leopold, Nikos Logathetis in monkey research. But our design, given its sampling nature, is not great to do that, because most of the time you don't see the full stimulus, so you don't really have good conditions for reversal.
Thank you. It was a great talk. I would like to ask you about inter-individual differences. Did you have a chance to look at how, well, because in the categorization task there's subject-specific reliance on particular features. Do you have a chance to look at how this evolves over time? If people keep relying on the same feature, or if they switch in or learn in, if there's a learning curve in terms of this, and if so, it follows a second part of my question is what would be the role of confidence, because I believe that there's no feedback in your task, so people need to rely on internal confidence or metacognitive process in terms of this.
Two great questions. So the last one is what we are doing now. We are studying confidence in the context of these sorts of tasks to seek to dissociate confidence judgment from categorization judgment. I can't really say much, everything is two pilots, but we seem to get to a differentiation at the moment, which is pretty good news. Now, the learning thing is an interesting one as well. Let me just go back to this task. It's going back a long way. Okay, we are getting there. Okay, we thought that this task would be a great way to study this learning, because obviously, when we collect subjective reports from participants, they say at the beginning it was awful. First, we have to trick them. When we tell them there's a face hidden in the noise, you have to detect it, it will be difficult, etc. So there's a little cover story. In fact, there's never any face. So we are thinking that over time they might firm up a template from memory, but firm it up, so that as the trials evolve, they become increasingly efficient at using their own template. So the way you can do this analysis is to split half your trials. You compute an internal model from the first half, and then the remaining half you bin them in bins of, 100 trials, say. And then you look how the correlation between your model and each template follows the participants' responses. And you would hope that as time evolves, that is, as trials evolve, as your template firms up, your correlation increases. And that's what we found. Yes. So we were very happy to see this. Of course, it has its own problem, because it's telling us that the participant is not stationary when all the analysis make this hypothesis. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Right, yeah. When doing an experiment like this, might you get more information if you had a weak face in there? So that you randomly sample some pixels from a face and add them in, so that
Yes.
there's more probability of getting face-like
Yes.
features coming up.
We did that. Yes, we did that, and it's indeed very useful to have spatial markers as to where to put the features. What we've also done is use more structured noise than this one, which were in this case truncated sinusoids or gabors, oriented gabors, and then you can get to much better reconstruction than this. In fact, I can maybe show you one. Let's see if I can quickly find one for you. You can get to beautiful per participant reconstructions from memory. Yeah. Okay. So what you see here is just the question you're asking, I think. So there's an average phase in the background, and to this average phase we add this Gabor noise essentially, as you can see here at the top. Come on. Okay, so you have this base phase, which is just average, and all of these Gabor noise will receive different amplitudes, random amplitudes. So you get to stimuli like this, and then the participant tell us if it's in this age category, that age category, or that one. And so across many trials you can build what it is that they want to see in the phase, and that's one participant giving us a young phase, a middle-aged phase, and a mid phase. Yeah. Yes?
In your experiment with the exclusive OR,
Yes.
if I remember clearly
Yes.
the curves, I think for the AND and the OR result, the hidden layer is only got one bump at a later time point, and the XOR had two peaks, one in quite early peak that almost overlap with the single feature ones. So that's the AND. So this is AND.
This one is the XOR.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So it's got this very clear bump, which is quite clearly
There
Toronto.
seems to be another bump in sort of around 90 milliseconds. Is that also a green?
No, that's a purple one.
It's a purple one.
Yes. So this is black and white left lens plus black and white right lens represented jointly on the same source activity.
It's both transparent and opaque.
Yes, that's right.
represented the same
Yeah,
place.
it's a 0 1. Yeah. Whereas here you have the model with the interaction performing better than the model without the interaction. And that's a log likelihood ratio essentially.
The XOR got sort of historical significance in terms of sort of perceptrons and learning numerical models.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, the differences for numerical to learn simple AND or OR is you only need 2 layers. And to learn XOR you need a third hidden
That's right.
layer. Does your results sort of inform a similar?
Not really. So what you have to remember is that what we are picking up here is an interaction between the representation of the two lenses. Okay. But picking up this interaction doesn't tell us really how it's being done downstream. So it could indeed be done with an intermediate layer, as in a typical nonlinear network, or it could be done quite differently, and this we don't know. And this is also why you get a nonlinear response in the case of XOR, but you also do get one in the case of OR and in the case of AND, because in both cases you have the interaction between the two lenses, when in fact the formal solution in AND and OR is a straight line. It's not a curve. Yes.
Did you mention that the XOR interaction was in the IPS, whereas the interaction for AND and OR was more ventral?
Yeah, you can see this. It's a bit more ventral. Oh, sorry. In AND, you also have a bit here, and in OR as well. Why, we don't know.
Was there a difference in behavior for those tasks?
Not really, no.
Well, if anyone would like to talk more informally to Professor Schyns, we'll be in
think all bar one by about 6:10. And it's my obligation to buy a drink for anyone who comes to join us to end the week in the department. So it only remains to thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All bar one is in Regent Street.
John, I'll join you there. There, 6:15 or something? Oh, I'm the one. Yeah. Have you fixed the rest of it? All right, I'll see you.
John, there you are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Because it was not my friend. I couldn't manipulate it as well. It's okay. Thank you. Hello.
I won't have time to join for the drink.